Why is it that some people seem to move through difficult tasks with a kind of steady grace, while others, equally intelligent, equally capable, find themselves paralyzed before they even begin? The answer isn't what you think. Most of us believe that doing hard things requires willpower, that we need to push harder, force ourselves, build discipline like a muscle. But the samurai understood something different. They knew that the hardest battles are won not through force, but through a principle they observed in nature itself. The lotus flower grows in muddy water, yet it rises through that mud without being stained by it. This is not metaphor. This is method. Meet Peter, an architect with 28 years of experience. He knows buildings. He understands structure, materials, how forces distribute through space. He can look at a set of blueprints and see immediately where the weight will settle, where the stress will accumulate, which walls can be removed and which must stay. But for the past 6 months he's been staring at a blank screen every morning, unable to begin the residential project that could define the final chapter of his career. It's not a matter of skill. It's not a matter of time. He has both. The problem is simpler and more devastating than that. He doesn't know how to begin something this big, and so he doesn't begin at all. This is where most people live, in the space between knowing what needs to be done and knowing how to do it. The Japanese have a word for this paralysis: shinpai. A worry that prevents action, a concern that consumes the mind before the hand can move. We've been taught to overcome this through discipline, through forcing ourselves to act despite discomfort, through sheer mental strength. We believe that successful people are those who've mastered the art of pushing through resistance. But Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the greatest swordsman who ever lived, wrote something curious in his Book of 5 Rings. He said that the warrior's mind should be like water, not like stone, not like iron, like water. Water doesn't force its way through obstacles. It finds the path. It adapts. It flows around resistance rather than trying to break through it. This is the first teaching of the Lotus Method. You are not trying to overcome your brain's resistance to hard things. You are training your brain to recognize a different path entirely, one that exists beneath the mud of confusion and doubt. Peter's mistake isn't his inability to start. His mistake is believing that starting means knowing, that he should be able to see the entire path before taking the first step. This is like expecting the lotus to bloom before it roots in the mud. The Japanese concept of mu, emptiness, teaches us something essential here. Before the thing exists, there is emptiness. This emptiness is not absence, it is potential. It is the space where creation becomes possible. Peter looks at his blank screen and sees failure, but what he's actually seeing is mu, the necessary emptiness that precedes all creation. Most mornings he sits there for 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, waiting for clarity that never comes. His coffee goes cold, his mind circles the same doubts. What if the design isn't innovative enough? What if his vision doesn't match the client's expectations? What if after 3 decades of work he's finally reached the limit of his abilities? These questions aren't helping him. They're the mud, and he's drowning in them because he believes he should be able to stand above them, clean and certain, before he begins. His wife notices. She asks if everything's okay with the project. He tells her it's fine, just working through some ideas. But they both know that's not true. She's seen him excited about work before. She's seen him challenged by work before. This is different. This is a man at war with himself. But the lotus doesn't grow that way. This is where the Lotus Method begins. 3 weeks after that blank morning, Peter does something different. He doesn't try to design the house. Instead, he draws a single line on paper. Not a structural line, not a meaningful line, just a line. The next morning he draws another. Not because it matters, because it roots him in the act of beginning. This is the practice of Kaizen applied not to improvement but to inception. The principle that massive change comes not through massive action, but through action so small it bypasses the brain's resistance entirely. The lotus doesn't burst through the mud in a single dramatic emergence. It sends down a root, then another root, then another. Each root is insignificant. Together they create the foundation that allows the flower to rise. But here's what Peter discovers that surprises him. Those meaningless lines aren't meaningless. His brain, relieved of the pressure to create something perfect or even purposeful, begins to play. A line becomes 2 lines. 2 lines suggest an angle. An angle implies a space. And suddenly, without him forcing it, the architecture begins to emerge. Not because he planned it, because he allowed it. Musashi understood this deeply. In combat, he said, the mind that tries to control every movement is the mind that loses. The mind that responds naturally to what is, this is the mind that wins. He called it machine, no mind. Not empty of thought, but empty of attachment to thought. Peter is learning to work in a state of machine. He shows up, he makes a mark. He lets the work teach him what it needs to become. This is the second teaching of the Lotus Method. The work itself contains the answers, but only if you begin without needing to know them. On the fourth week, something shifts. Peter arrives at his desk and doesn't feel the familiar dread. Not because the project has become easier, not because he's suddenly figured everything out, but because the daily practice of beginning without knowing, without certainty, has created a new neural pathway. His brain has learned that not knowing is survivable, more than survivable, workable. Think about what's actually happening in Peter's mind during these weeks. For 6 months his brain associated this project with threat. Every time he opened that blank file, his amygdala fired warning signals. Potential failure. His nervous system responded as if he were facing a physical threat, flooding his body with cortisol, narrowing his focus, preparing him for fight or flight. But there was no enemy to fight, no danger to flee. Just a blank screen and his own expectations. By beginning without attachment to outcome, by drawing meaningless lines, Peter was teaching his brain a different truth. That engagement with the work was safe, that he could touch the project without being destroyed by it, that not knowing wasn't dangerous, it was simply a state to move through. Yet there is something more happening here, something deeper. After 2 months of this practice, Peter notices that his resistance to beginning has changed. The paralysis that used to grip him each morning has loosened, not because the task became easier, because his relationship to not knowing has transformed. Zen practitioners speak of Shoshin, beginner's mind, the ability to approach even familiar things with fresh perception, without the burden of expertise clouding direct experience. Peter is discovering that the hardest part of doing hard things isn't the difficulty of the thing itself, it's the expert's fear of being a beginner again. He spent 28 years building expertise. That expertise became his identity. When someone asked him who he was, he didn't say, "I'm Peter," he said, "I'm an architect." And when he encountered something outside that expertise, this unfamiliar creative challenge, his identity rebelled. Better to do nothing than to risk being seen as someone who doesn't know. The lotus has no such concerns. It doesn't worry about whether it's expert enough to bloom. It doesn't question whether it has the credentials to push through mud. It simply roots, and grows, and emerges. This is what the samurai meant by Fudo Shun, immovable mind. Not a mind that refuses to move, but a mind that cannot be moved from its purpose by fear of inadequacy. The warrior faces the opponent not by pretending to know every move, but by committing to the moment fully, regardless of knowing. The samurai accepted that every battle contained the possibility of death. This acceptance didn't weaken them, it freed them. Because once you accept the worst possible outcome, you're no longer fighting to avoid it. You're simply present with what is. Peter's colleague asks him one afternoon how the project is going. Peter pauses. He doesn't say it's going well or poorly, he says, "It's teaching me." This is the language of someone who has stopped fighting the mud. Peter begins to work with what the Japanese craftsmen call ma, the space between things. In traditional Japanese architecture, ma isn't empty space to be filled, it's intentional emptiness that gives meaning to what surrounds it. The pause that makes the note meaningful, the silence that gives weight to the word. He stops trying to fill every moment of his project with productive output. Instead, he allows ma to exist in his process. Days where he simply observes the land where this house will sit. Hours where he does nothing but sketch ideas he knows he'll discard. Mornings where he walks the perimeter of the property, feeling the slope of the ground beneath his feet, noticing how light moves through the trees at different times of day. This spaciousness doesn't slow his progress. It accelerates it, because within that space, his subconscious does the work his conscious mind cannot force. One evening he's washing dishes, not thinking about the project, when a solution to a structural problem appears fully formed in his mind. Not because he worked harder, because he allowed ma, because he trusted the process of rooting before blooming. The solution is elegant, simple, something he never would have arrived at through direct thinking. It came through the side door when his attention was elsewhere. But this is not the final teaching. 6 months after his first meaningless line, Peter presents his design. It's unlike anything he's created before. More daring, more personal. The client leans forward, studying the renderings. She asks him how he developed such a novel approach. Peter pauses. He doesn't have a simple answer, because the process wasn't simple. It was organic. It grew. Like a lotus. This is what training your brain to do hard things actually looks like. Not the warrior forcing himself up the mountain through sheer will, but the water finding its way down through whatever path appears. Not because water is weak, because water is wise. The Lotus Method has 3 movements, and you've seen them now. First, root in mu. Begin without knowing. Make the first mark not because it's right, but because it connects you to the work. Let your action be so small it bypasses resistance. A single word, a single step, not toward the goal, into the work itself. This is counterintuitive, because we've been taught that beginning requires clarity, that we should know where we're going before we start walking. But the path doesn't exist before you walk it. The path is created by walking. Peter didn't need a complete vision of the house before he drew that first line. The work reveals itself through engagement, not through planning. When you make your action small enough, you remove the stakes. A single line can't be wrong. And when you remove the possibility of failure from the first step, you remove the barrier to beginning. This is not laziness. This is strategy. You're not lowering your standards. You're acknowledging how your brain actually works. The primitive part of your mind that controls motivation doesn't understand long-term goals. It understands immediate safety and immediate reward. When you make the first action tiny, you make it safe. When you make it safe, you can begin. Second, practice Moshin. Release your attachment to knowing how it should unfold. Let the work teach you what it needs to become. Trust that your expertise serves you not by providing answers but by allowing you to recognize answers when the work reveals them. This is the difference between forcing competence and allowing mastery. When Peter stopped trying to control the design and started responding to what emerged, his decades of experience didn't disappear. They became available in a different way, not as a rigid framework forcing certain solutions, but as a sensitive instrument detecting possibilities he couldn't have planned. The expert who clings to expertise becomes rigid. The expert who releases into Moshin becomes fluid. And fluidity is what allows you to move through difficulty without breaking. There's a paradox here that the samurai understood well. The more you know, the more you must be willing to not know. The more skilled you become, the more you must protect beginner's mind. Because expertise without flexibility is prison. It locks you into solutions that worked before, preventing you from seeing what's actually needed now. Third, honor ma. Build spaciousness into your process. The hard thing becomes impossible when you demand constant progress. But when you allow the pauses, the observation, the moments of simply being with the difficulty without needing to resolve it, this is when transformation happens. Not because you pushed hard, because you stopped pushing and started flowing. Peter's walks around the property weren't wasted time. They were essential time. The moments when he wasn't actively designing were the moments when the design was organizing itself beneath his conscious awareness. This is how the brain actually solves complex problems, not through constant forcing but through cycles of engagement and release. The lotus grows in darkness under the water before it ever breaks the surface. That hidden growth isn't separate from the bloom. It is the bloom. Western culture treats rest as the absence of work, but the Japanese understanding of ma is different. Rest is not absence. Rest is presence of a different kind. Some will say this sounds passive, that real achievement requires aggression, ambition, the refusal to accept limits. But you will know something they don't. The lotus doesn't become beautiful by fighting the mud. It becomes beautiful by accepting the mud as the necessary condition for its existence. The mud isn't the obstacle to the flower. The mud is what feeds the flower. Your confusion isn't preventing you from doing the hard thing. Your confusion is where the hard thing begins. Peter's project succeeded not because he figured it out before he started. It succeeded because he started before he figured it out. And in that starting, that rooting in uncertainty, his brain learned something it couldn't learn through planning or preparation or force of will. It learned that not knowing isn't the problem. The samurai walked into battle knowing they might die. This wasn't pessimism. This was awareness. They didn't fight by pretending death wasn't possible. They fought by accepting that death was always possible. This freed them to respond with complete presence rather than rigid planning. You face your hard thing the same way, not by eliminating the uncertainty, by becoming someone who moves through uncertainty, with the same steady grace the lotus shows rising through mud. This is not a metaphor about perseverance. This is a method about transformation. You train your brain to do hard things by training it to begin in the place where beginning seems impossible. By making the smallest possible mark, by releasing your attachment to knowing the outcome, by allowing spaciousness around the difficulty, by trusting that the path emerges through walking it, not before. The mud doesn't become less muddy. You become the lotus. And here is what Peter understands now that he didn't understand 6 months ago. The hard thing was never the project. The hard thing was his relationship to not knowing. Once that relationship transformed, the project became not easy, but workable, approachable, even in its own way joyful, because he stopped waiting for certainty and started trusting the process of emergence. This is available to you, not someday, tomorrow morning. With whatever hard thing you've been avoiding because you don't know how. You don't need to know how. You need to root. The lotus doesn't study botany before it grows. It doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It doesn't require clarity about the exact path from seed to flower. It simply begins in the mud, through the mud. And so can you. If you found insight in this video, please subscribe for more videos to help you along your path. And a question to carry with you: what hard thing have you been refusing to begin because you're waiting to know how? What would happen if you made one meaningless mark tomorrow just to root yourself in the work? Thank you for watching. See you next time. And as always, remember to stay in tune with your own mind frequency.